What kind of soldier brings a medieval longbow into a modern world war? They mocked his nearly 6-foot bow, called him outdated. Some even whispered he was insane. But in just 3 days, that so-called relic of another century silently dropped 7 German sergeants and turned ridicule into raw fear. Today we uncover the unbelievable story of the man who made World War II tremble. At 7:42 a.m. on May 27, 1940, a cold mist smothered the fields outside the French village of Lepinay. Behind a broken stone wall, Captain Jack Churchill watched 5 German soldiers move toward him through the fog. Europe had already seen what these men could do. Poland had fallen in 36 days. Now, German armor was slicing through France, and the British Expeditionary Force was running for the sea. In 72 hours, Churchill's company had lost 11 men. The roads to Dunkirk were choked with smoke-burning trucks and soldiers sprinting towards survival. Officers burned documents in ditches. Privates threw away rifles just to run faster. The retreat had become a rout. But Jack Churchill was not running. He was 33, 14 years out of Sandhurst, with 0 confirmed kills. Slung across his back was a 6-foot English longbow with a 70-pound draw weight, deadly at 200 yards in skilled hands. Churchill's hands were skilled. Less than a year earlier, he had represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships in Oslo. Not a champion, but accurate enough to split a playing card at 50 yards. Accurate enough to kill before the target ever heard the shot. The German patrol closed to 30 yards. Close enough. Churchill focused on the sergeant leading them, a cautious veteran scanning hedges and windows for rifles and machine guns. He was searching for modern threats. He never imagined something medieval. Churchill drew the bowstring back to his ear. The wood bent and creaked. His fingers found the anchor point he had practiced thousands of times. He had made this shot at straw targets again and again. Never at a living man. He released. The arrow sliced through the mist. The sergeant dropped without a sound, the shaft buried deep in his chest. No muzzle flash, no gunshot, just sudden confusion. It was the first confirmed longbow kill in a European war since the 17th century and the last of the Second World War. It happened because one British officer refused to believe that modern warfare had erased ancient weapons. The British Army never quite knew what to do with him. Churchill had graduated from Sandhurst in 1926 and served properly in Burma. Then, bored with peacetime routine, he resigned in 1936. He worked as a newspaper editor in Nairobi, appeared in films as an archer and bagpiper, including a role in The Thief of Baghdad, and rode a motorcycle 1,500 miles across Burma and India, once crashing into a water buffalo. War for Churchill was not chaos, it was clarity. When Britain declared war in 1939, he rejoined immediately, bringing his longbow, a Scottish broadsword, and his Highland bagpipes. Fellow officers called him eccentric. Some thought him unstable. There were no regulations for medieval weapons on a battlefield dominated by tanks and 88mm guns. Churchill understood the math. Rifles fired faster. Tanks crushed infantry. Aircraft ruled the sky. But he also understood something doctrine could not measure: fear. In close combat, psychology mattered. A man charging with a broadsword and a war cry could shatter nerves. A silent arrow in the fog could make seasoned soldiers feel hunted. Between May 26 and June 4, 1943, 138,000 Allied troops escaped from Dunkirk, leaving behind equipment vehicles, Pride. They came home expecting invasion. Jack Churchill came home with his bow, his sword, and his bagpipes. He had covered the retreat. He had killed with weapons fit for a museum, and he was only getting started. If you want to witness how Churchill's medieval arsenal clashed with the Wehrmacht's elite forces, how a longbow, a broadsword, and a set of bagpipes cut through the machinery of modern war, make sure to hit that like button. It helps bring these forgotten, almost unbelievable stories back into the light. And subscribe if you haven't already, because this was only the beginning of Jack Churchill's war. Within weeks of returning from Dunkirk, while most of Britain braced for invasion, Jack Churchill volunteered for a new unit the War Office was forming in secrecy. They called themselves the Commandos. The concept was simple and brutal. Small teams of highly trained men would raid the coastlines of Nazi-occupied Europe, destroy facilities, kill German troops, gather intelligence, and disappear before reinforcements could arrive. The missions would be dangerous. The training would be worse. Casualty rates were expected to be catastrophic. Volunteers only. Churchill stepped forward immediately and then calmly requested permission to bring his longbow and broadsword on operations. The Commandos astonishingly said yes. In June 1940, Britain stood alone. Most heavy equipment had been abandoned at Dunkirk. An invasion felt imminent. Prime Minister Winston Churchill demanded a force that could strike back, even symbolically, to prove Britain was still in the fight. Number 3 Commando began training in the Scottish Highlands around Achnacarry, where the regiment pushed men beyond their limits. They marched 30 miles a day with full packs over mountains and bog. They practiced amphibious landings in freezing water that burned the lungs. They trained in silent killing knives, garrots, bare hands. Live rounds cracked overhead during exercises. Anyone who failed was sent back to his old unit in disgrace. Churchill did not fail. Older than most volunteers, he was stronger and more relentless. He could outmarch men 10 years younger, shoot straighter, fight longer, and he possessed skills no other commando had: the ability to drive an arrow into a target at 200 yards, to wield a broadsword like a medieval knight, and to march into danger with Highland bagpipes screaming against the wind. At first, the others were unsure whether he was eccentric or insane. But over time, they understood his logic. Churchill did not carry ancient weapons because he thought them superior to rifles. He carried them because war was psychological. A German soldier facing a rifle knew the threat. He had trained for it. But a German soldier confronted by a man charging with a broadsword while bagpipes wailed had no training for that moment. His mind would hesitate just for a second, trying to process the impossible. And in combat, a single second could mean death. By the autumn of 1941, Churchill had been promoted to second in command of Number 3 Commando. After several small raids along the Norwegian coast, a major operation was ordered from Combined Operations Headquarters. The target was Vågsøy, a strategically vital island controlling fjords used to ship Swedish iron ore to Germany. Around 150 German soldiers defended it, supported by coastal artillery, anti-aircraft guns, machine guns, and fortified positions. Fish oil factories there were producing glycerin for explosives. The assault, codenamed Operation Archery, was set for dawn on December 27, 1941. Royal Navy cruisers would bombard the defenses. The Royal Air Force would provide cover. Then the commandos would land on multiple beaches, strike fast and violently, and withdraw before German reinforcements could trap them. Churchill studied the intelligence obsessively. The defenders were trained and well armed. Coastal guns could destroy landing craft before they reached shore. Surprise and shock would be everything. He requested permission to lead the first wave onto Malloy Island, a fortified position guarding the approach to South Vogsoy. Permission was granted. He then requested permission to carry his broadsword and play his bagpipes during the assault. Again, permission was granted, though several senior officers quietly questioned his sanity. On the night before the raid, Churchill checked his equipment one final time. His broadsword was razor sharp. His bagpipes were tuned. He carried grenades, a revolver, and a Thompson submachine gun as backup. But when the landing craft cut through the icy Norwegian waters toward the beach at dawn, he intended to lead not with bullets, but with steel and music. The commandos boarded their transport ships on Christmas Day 1941. There were no carols, no warmth, only steel decks glazed with ice and the dark pull of the Norwegian Sea ahead. As the convoy pushed north past Scotland, the temperature dropped below freezing. Ice crept along the railings. Below deck, men checked weapons in silence, wrote letters home, and tried not to picture what waited on the other side of the Arctic night. Jack Churchill did not sleep. He studied maps under dim light, rehearsed hand signals, and memorized the layout of Malloy Island. He had 105 commandos under his command. Their mission was simple in wording and lethal in consequence: land, storm the German shore battery, and neutralize it within 10 minutes. Fail and the coastal guns would rip apart the landing craft, drowning hundreds in black, freezing water. At 8:45 a.m. on December 27th, the ships reached their launch point 12 miles offshore. Landing craft were lowered into the icy sea. Commandos climbed down cargo nets in full gear boots, slipping hands numb. Churchill took his place at the bow of the lead craft, bagpipes tucked beneath his arm, broadsword hanging at his side. In less than 2 hours, he would either be another casualty or something far more enduring. They advanced through a curtain of smoke laid by RAF bombers. Behind them, the cruiser HMS Kenya hurled 6-inch shells toward the German positions, the blasts rolling across the fjord like thunder. The coastline flashed with explosions. Churchill remained standing in the bow, fully exposed, while his men crouched low. The distance closed 200 yards, 150-100. At 8:48 a.m., the ramp dropped onto the rocky beach. Before a single rifle fired from his line, Churchill stepped into the freezing surf and began playing the March of the Cameron Men. The bagpipes wailed through smoke and gunfire, wild and unmistakably Scottish. German gunners froze in disbelief. They had trained to repel soldiers with rifles and grenades. They had not trained for a man advancing through artillery fire while playing music. Churchill finished the tune calmly, set down the pipes, pulled a grenade, and hurled it into the nearest position. Then he drew his broadsword and charged up the beach, shouting for his men to follow. The commandos surged behind him, Thompsons roaring. Shock did the rest. The German defense faltered, disorganized by the sheer audacity of the assault. Bunkers were cleared one by one. Explosives destroyed the coastal guns. The anti-aircraft battery was overrun. Within 10 minutes, the shore battery was silenced. But the battle was far from over. A radio message crackled in the main force, attacking South Vogsoy, was pinned down. German reinforcements had arrived overnight. Street fighting had erupted. Casualties were mounting. Without hesitation, Churchill gathered his remaining men and crossed the narrow strait to reinforce the town. He stepped into chaos, snipers firing from rooftops, machine guns locking down streets, British troops trapped behind stone walls. Sword in hand, Churchill led a flanking attack through a side street, moving from cover to cover under fire. His men split the German defenses, pressing from multiple angles until resistance began to collapse. The fighting dragged on into the afternoon, building by room by room. Demolition charges leveled the fish oil factories, producing glycerin for explosives. Documents were seized. More than 100 prisoners were taken. The victory carried a price: 17 commandos dead, 53 wounded. Close combat in frozen streets left little room for mercy. Yet Churchill emerged unscathed. His sword was bloodied, his bagpipes undamaged, his name sealed in memory. The raid on Vogsoy became the first major commando success of the war. It proved that small aggressive forces could strike deep into occupied territory and survive. It proved that shock and psychology could shatter fortified defenses. And it forced Germany to divert 30,000 troops to guard Norway's coastline soldiers who would not fight in Russia or North Africa. From that day forward, the British Army stopped questioning Jack Churchill's medieval arsenal. The man who played bagpipes into battle and charged with a broadsword was no longer an eccentric curiosity. He was a weapon. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you tuning in from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany, France, Italy, or somewhere else in the world? Let us know your country and city. We'd love to see how far this story has traveled. By the summer of 1943, Jack Churchill had been promoted to commanding officer of No. 2 Commando. The war was shifting south, and so was he, from the surf of Sicily to the mountains of Italy, toward an exploit so improbable it sounded like legend. 42 German soldiers were about to learn that surrendering to a man with a sword was preferable to testing its edge. On July 9, 1943, Operation Husky began the largest amphibious assault the world had yet seen. Within 72 hours, 160,000 Allied troops stormed Sicily. The objective was blunt knock Italy out of the war and open a new front against Germany. Churchill landed on the eastern coast with his full arsenal broadsword at his waist, longbow across his back, bagpipes under his arm. His men no longer questioned it. They had seen what shock could do. In Sicily's mountains, villages turned into fortresses and roads into killing zones. Churchill bypassed strong points, cut supply lines, struck fast, and vanished. By September, Sicily had fallen. The Allies crossed to the mainland. Salerno was supposed to be lightly defended. Intelligence said the Germans expected an attack near Rome. Intelligence was wrong. On September 9, 1943, No. 2 Commando hit the beaches and was met with artillery armor and disciplined resistance. The beachhead wavered. American and British units were pinned down. The invasion threatened to unravel before it could take root. Churchill's men were ordered to hold the road and rail junction at Vietri-sul-Mare, overlooking the western flank of the Bay of Salerno. If it fell, German guns could rake the beaches and crush the landing force. For 5 consecutive days, Churchill fought from shattered houses, ditches, and rubble. They repelled infantry assaults and tank probes, called in naval gunfire, and held their ground as ammunition thinned and casualties rose. They did not yield. Then came a new problem. German forces had seized the hills above Molina and established an observation post directing artillery onto Allied positions. A frontal assault would be suicide machine guns covered the slopes, mortars were pre-sighted. Churchill chose another approach. He would take 1 corporal and infiltrate at night. 2 men could pass where 200 would be seen. After midnight, they slipped through darkness, crawling along drainage ditches and stone walls, avoiding sentries by inches. Just before dawn, Churchill saw the glow of cigarettes. German mortar crews relaxed and unsuspecting. He drew his broadsword and stepped forward from the shadows, calm and composed, as if time had folded in on itself. The Germans froze. Faced with a British officer holding a medieval blade and speaking with quiet authority, they surrendered without firing a shot. Churchill bound the first prisoner with his revolver lanyard and used him to approach the next position. He repeated the method, sudden appearance, steady voice sword, catching the gray light. Each group capitulated. Shock replaced resistance. By sunrise, Churchill and 1 corporal had captured 42 German soldiers, including an entire mortar squad. They marched their prisoners back down the hill in stunned silence, wounded, carried on carts pushed by their own comrades. It looked less like mechanized war and more like a scene from a century past. For Molina, Churchill received the Distinguished Service Order. The citation praised courage, initiative, and leadership. It did not mention the sword. Some truths were too extraordinary for official prose. But among the men who had seen it, the lesson was clear. In the right hands, audacity could be deadlier than firepower. By September 20th, 1943, the Salerno beachhead was finally secure. The Allies began their slow-grinding push north toward Rome, fighting for every ridge and river crossing. Churchill and No. 2 Commando moved ahead of the main force, raiding German positions, cutting communications, snatching prisoners in the dark. His reputation had outgrown the British Army. German soldiers were whispering about him now, the officer with the sword and the bagpipes. Some called him a madman. Others called him a berserker. A relic from another century who had wandered into modern war. A few refused to believe he existed at all. Most simply hoped they would never meet him. By the spring of 1944, the Italian campaign had hardened into stalemate. The Germans clung to the high ground along the Gustav Line. Every assault cost blood. The Allies needed pressure elsewhere. Churchill received new orders, transferred to Yugoslavia, to support partisan fighters battling German occupation forces. It would be brutal country, mountains, forests, ambushes at every turn. And the Germans there had already heard the stories. Yugoslavia was one of the harshest theaters of the war. German forces held the cities and main roads, but communist partisans under Josip Broz Tito dominated the hills. Reprisals were savage. Villages burned. Prisoners were rarely taken. More than 500,000 German troops were tied down there, and still the resistance grew. Britain decided to back Tito with weapon supplies and military advisors. The commandos would fight beside the partisans. In April 1944, Churchill and his men were sent to the Adriatic island of Vis, launching point for raids along the Dalmatian coast. He adapted quickly, studying terrain, learning partisan tactics, planning strikes on supply lines and outposts. The first operations were sharp and effective. German garrisons felt the pressure. Patrols increased. Reinforcements arrived. Something had shifted. The madman with a sword was in their sector now. In May 1944 came orders to seize the German-held island of Broadsword, which controlled vital shipping lanes. The garrison numbered several hundred entrenched in fortified hill positions. Churchill assembled a mixed force, British commandos, and roughly 1,500 Yugoslav partisans. Brave men, but unevenly trained and loosely coordinated. The landing on May 2nd was unopposed. The Germans had withdrawn to prepare defenses in the hills. Surprise was slipping away. The partisans hesitated, unwilling to assault fortified positions in darkness. Churchill argued furious that delay meant German reinforcements and artillery adjustments. But he could not compel them. They waited through the night, and by dawn, the advantage was gone. The assault began under full daylight. Number 43 Commando launched a flanking move while Churchill led a direct push uphill. The partisans stayed near the beach. The commandos climbed alone into machine gun fire. Mortars began falling among them, precise and punishing. Churchill advanced with bagpipes, skirling sword at his side, urging his men forward through smoke and shattered stone. Then the mortars found their mark. A German team zeroed in on the cluster of commandos around Churchill. The rounds exploded with brutal accuracy. Men were killed or wounded instantly. When the smoke cleared, Churchill was the only one standing alive by chance because he had stepped a few paces away to play his pipes. He was alone on the hillside, surrounded by the dead and dying. Ammunition was gone. Retreat was impossible. German troops advanced cautiously toward him. Churchill did not run. He sat on a rock amid the wreckage, lifted his bagpipes, and began to play Will Ye. No Come Back Again, a lament heavy with farewell. The melody drifted over the slope where moments earlier men had fought and fallen. The Germans slowed as they approached, rifles trained on him, unsure of what they were witnessing. A British officer alone surrounded, playing music instead of begging for life. They did not shoot. Confusion held them. Perhaps curiosity. Perhaps a grudging respect for a man who faced capture or death with such impossible calm. Before we close this chapter, let us ask you something personal. Did anyone in your family serve in World War II on any side of the conflict? If so, share their story and where they served. A German grenade detonated near Churchill on the hillside of Broadsword, the blast knocking him unconscious and ending the fight in an instant. When he came to, rifles were pointed at him. His men lay dead or wounded around him. The madman with the sword was now a captive. The Germans wasted no time. His name alone, Churchill, triggered suspicion. Surely they reasoned he must be related to the British Prime Minister. Perhaps he carried secrets. Perhaps he was valuable leverage. He was flown to Berlin under heavy guard for interrogation. The officers who questioned him expected strategic intelligence. What they found instead was a stubborn commando officer with no connection to Winston Churchill and no access to grand plans. He had no state secrets to trade, only a reputation built on audacity, steel, and music. Disappointed, the Germans sent him to Sachsenhausen concentration camp north of Berlin, placing him in a special compound reserved for prominent prisoners, politicians, resistance leaders, and men considered useful as hostages. Sachsenhausen was not designed for survival. It was a place of exhaustion, hunger, and slow death. The SS guards expected obedience and despair. Churchill gave them neither. Confined in the Zellenbau compound alongside diplomats and senior Allied officers, including survivors of the Great Escape from Stalag Luft III, he immediately began studying the camp. He memorized guard rotations, mapped fence lines, noted watchtower blind spots. Within weeks, he had assembled a small group of co-conspirators. Using spoons, bits of scrap metal, and bare hands, they began digging a tunnel from a drainage ditch in the garden area near the perimeter fence. They worked at night, hiding loose soil beneath compost piles. Inch by inch, the tunnel stretched more than 100 meters beneath the wire. On September 23, 1944, Churchill and 4 other officers crawled through the darkness and into freedom. He paired with squadron leader Bertram James. Their plan was as bold as it was desperate: march nearly 200 kilometers north to the Baltic coast and find passage to neutral Sweden. They traveled by night and hid by day, stealing vegetables from fields, drinking from streams, avoiding roads and villages. Autumn winds cut through their thin prison clothes. They carried no maps, no compass, no supplies beyond what they could scavenge. Churchill was sent south to an Austrian camp deep in the Alps. By late 1944, Germany was unraveling. Soviet forces pressed from the east. Allied armies surged through France toward the Rhine. Yet in a mountain prison, liberation felt impossibly distant. Through the winter of 1944 to 45, Churchill watched the Reich collapse from behind barbed wire. Bombers droned overhead. Guards grew anxious. Rumors spread of defeat and revenge. In April 1945, as Germany's end approached, Churchill and roughly 140 other high-profile prisoners were marched into the Tyrol region of northern Italy. The SS intended to use them as bargaining chips, or worse. The prisoners feared execution more than captivity. Then unexpectedly, regular Wehrmacht officers intervened. Unwilling to see the captives murdered in a final act of fanaticism, they confronted the SS guards. After a tense standoff, the SS withdrew. The prisoners were left in a small Italian village, free but stranded behind crumbling enemy lines. Most waited for Allied forces. Jack Churchill did not. After nearly a year in captivity after escape, recapture, and survival, he refused to sit idle while the war still smoldered. Injured, underfed, unarmed, he began walking south through the Alps toward Allied territory. He covered roughly 150 kilometers on foot over 8 days, crossing mountain passes, avoiding stray German units, pushing through hunger and pain. Near Verona, he encountered an American armored reconnaissance unit. The soldiers stared at the ragged British officer who claimed to be a commando lieutenant colonel. He had no documents, no insignia, no proof. He convinced them anyway through composure, authority, and a story so extraordinary it sounded like legend. The Americans sent him home. The Germans had captured him, imprisoned him, tried to contain him. They had never broken him. Jack Churchill returned home in May 1945 as Europe exhaled. Germany had surrendered. The camps were being liberated. The guns had fallen silent across the continent. But for Churchill, the war did not feel finished. Japan was still fighting. British troops were still dying in Burma, Malaya, and across the islands of Southeast Asia. While others celebrated, he submitted a request transfer to the Far East. He wanted one more campaign, one more landing, one more chance to carry his sword ashore and let the bagpipes cut through gunfire. The War Office approved it. By the summer of 1945, Churchill was sailing east, heading toward Burma and beyond it, Japan. He studied Japanese tactics, memorized defensive patterns, prepared for the brutal invasion everyone expected would come. He imagined leading commandos and onto another hostile beach, steel at his side, music in the air. Then history changed course. On August 6, 1945, while Churchill was somewhere over India, an American B-29 dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. In seconds, a city was shattered. 3 days later, Nagasaki burned. On August 15th, Japan surrendered. The Second World War was over. Churchill received the news not with relief, but with frustration. Months of preparation vanished overnight. There would be no invasion of Japan, no final test, no last battle to measure himself against. Those who served with him remembered his dark humor. He reportedly muttered that without the atomic bombs, the war might have gone on another 10 years. It was half a joke, half a confession. Combat was where he felt most alive. Peace was unfamiliar territory. The British Army now faced a problem. What does a nation do with a warrior when there is no war left to fight? Churchill's record was extraordinary. Distinguished Service Order with Bar Military Cross, with Bar mentioned in dispatches again and again. France, Norway, Sicily, Italy, Yugoslavia, a concentration camp escape. 42 prisoners taken with a sword. He was too aggressive for quiet garrison life, too unconventional for comfortable staff roles, too well known to sideline. In 1947, Churchill was sent to Palestine as second in command of the 1st Battalion Highland Light Infantry. The land was on the brink. Jewish survivors of the Holocaust were arriving in great numbers, demanding a homeland. Arab Palestinians resisted fiercely. British soldiers stood between two rising tides of anger, attacked by both. Bombings and ambushes became routine as Britain prepared to withdraw. He left Palestine shortly before Britain withdrew in May 1948. Israel declared independence. War followed immediately. Churchill returned home at 41, decorated and battle-hardened, unsure what to do with peace. The Army assigned him training and staff roles. He even qualified as a parachutist in his 40s, chasing adrenaline in the open sky. He trained younger soldiers in commando tactics, passing on hard-earned lessons. But peacetime service could never match combat's intensity. He retired in 1959 as a lieutenant colonel after more than 3 decades in uniform. Retirement did not quiet him. He built radio-controlled warships, restored old steam launches, and played bagpipes at regimental events. Even his commute became legend. He would toss his briefcase from a moving train into his garden to avoid walking from the station. When asked about his wartime exploits, he never exaggerated. He had killed with a longbow in the age of tanks, captured 42 prisoners with a sword in the age of machine guns, played bagpipes under mortar fire, escaped a concentration camp, and walked across mountains to freedom. The truth needed no embellishment. Jack Churchill died on March 8, 1996, at 89. He had outlived most of the men he fought beside and against. He was not the war's most decorated general, nor its greatest strategist. But he proved something enduring, that individual courage still matters, that imagination can defy convention, and that one determined man can leave a mark no modern weapon can erase. If this story stayed with you, share it. Tell us where you're watching from and whether someone in your family served in wartime. Stories like his survive only because people choose to remember them.